All right, folks, we're going to take a quick look at post-World War II Latin America. Not hitting every country. I honestly had hoped to do something special with Bolivia, and I just ran out of time. So it is not happening this year, but maybe we can talk about that in class. I think some of the ignorance about Latin America in general from the U.S. perspective, former Vice President Dan Quayle said, and he was not trying to be funny, I was recently on a tour of Latin America, and the only regret I have is I didn't study Latin hard enough in school so I could converse with those people. And he meant that. He didn't get it. Latin America, of course, are parts of the American continents that speak a Latin language, i.e. French, Portuguese, Spanish, as opposed to English, which is a Germanic language. So, of course, as you know, it collectively includes Central America, or Mesoamerica as it's called. It includes the Caribbean countries, South America, Mexico, I guess we could also consider part of Central America. Well, it really depends, but it's in that general region that you're looking at now. By the way, I think there are going to be horrible little clicking sounds as I go from every slide to the next. I'm using the school laptop and I can't figure out how to get rid of it. You know, you may have heard the phrase before, third world countries, first world, second world. This comes out of the Cold War. There was a distinction made, and I forget the name of the guy, but he was a political scientist who said, you know, now that the war is over, we are dividing into sort of three separate groups. We have the United States and its allies, and that's primarily Western Europe, the NATO countries, but also would include other allies. I guess, well, you know what, we're really talking Western Europe and the United States. And then the Soviet Union, which of course had its allies, i.e. in Eastern Europe, and in a way, maybe eventually countries like China, but you know, those are never solid alliances. And then there's the so-called rest of the world, the poorer world, the third world as it's called. That term is not really used anymore because we don't have this communism, capitalism dichotomy any longer, but it still is sometimes used to refer to, well, the darker nations, people with darker skin. Vijay Prashad, an historian in the United States, has used that term, the darker nations. It is what, remember Du Bois said, the line of the 20th century is going to be the color line. Honestly, the third world is the darker skinned people of the world, the non-European derived. And really, as mentioned, that's what the competition is about. Cold War competition for control of Western Europe, that's over by 1950. It just is. It is. Who's going to control Czechoslovakia? It's in the communist bloc. But all the questioning is going to be in other parts of the world. And today, as I said, we are looking at Latin America. Cuba, of course, stands out. Now, Cuba used to be a Spanish possession, as you know. It's one of the last bits of the Spanish Empire. The United States goes to war with Spain in 1898. It is the Spanish-American War. Spain is destroyed. Their navy is crushed. And the United States has some choices. Well, you know what? Cuba, think about all the sugar wealth. We have major U.S. corporations invested there. On the other hand, do we really want to take in a bunch of non-English speaking, you know, Latin Americans into the United States? What happens is that the United States, Cuba does become independent in 1898, but the United States controls it. Absolutely. The United States repeatedly sends in troops if they don't like what's happening in Cuba. Cuba's foreign policy is determined by the United States. Whoever is politically in charge of Cuba does it only with the United States' permission. And you wouldn't be surprised, there is a lot of hostility toward the United States in Cuba. Remember that the Truman Doctrine talked about supporting free peoples everywhere. You know, the Batista dictatorship in Cuba, they had a terribly low literacy rate. It had police violence against people. Freedom of speech was not allowed. By almost no standards would you call it a free society. But what it was a non-communist society. So the United States gave pretty unending support. In 1959, Fidel Castro, who this very week, his brother, is stepping down from power in Cuba after 63 years. Longer story to this, but he leads a rebellion and successfully takes it over. Now, a lot of debate about Castro. Was Castro a die-hard communist? Was Castro a nationalist? Was Castro hell-bent on terrible relations with the United States? Could there have been a way to work with Castro? The bottom line, though, is that he spoke in anti-U.S. rhetoric. The United States was absolutely in the Cold War, unwilling to accept anybody that was even remotely open to left-wing ideas, etc. The United States, by the way, had already overthrown a government in Guatemala with a far less radical leader. The United States almost immediately starts an embargo, cuts off trade to Cuba, almost entirely in most cases. And here we are in 2021, and that is still in effect. It's very hard to buy and sell stuff from Cuba or for American citizens to go to Cuba. There are, as you would probably know, some very legitimate human rights concerns about Cuba over the last 60 years. I would also argue the United States has had a much, much more open and accepting policy to governments that were a lot more harsh toward their own people. Almost immediately, though, when Castro takes power, forms ties with the Soviet Union, the United States begins a series of plans to overthrow Fidel. You see what? An embargo here, it's an official ban on trade or other commercial activity. Fidel Castro, by the way, in 1959 came to the United States, and one of these twists of history, would history have been different in Cuba and in the world if Fidel Castro had had a better curveball? Why do I say this? He was a baseball player. He actually had had a tryout, as I understand it, with the Washington Senators, which used to be a baseball team at some point. You know, kind of fascinating. If Fidel Castro, the young lawyer turned revolutionary turned leader of Cuba, had had a better curveball, might he have made the major leagues and history would have changed? Who knows about it? As mentioned with Castro, attempts to assassinate him. There have been dozens of demonstrated U.S. government, CIA attempts to assassinate him, everything from having his cigars explode to sending mafia-affiliated hitmen into Cuba. There was even, and I'm not making this up, there was even an actual plot that was uncovered. And this is not like weird conspiracy some people say. This is openly documented in released documents since, in which something was going to be put into Castro's food, a depilatory. What does that do? It makes hair fall out, including beard hair. This is an actual U.S. government plot, because part of Castro's mystique was his full beard, and if his beard fell out, this might affect how the Cuban people feel about him. So this is real, and again, you can be very critical and should be of the Castro regime, but understand the greatest power in the history of the world is 60 miles from your island and is doing all in its power to destroy your government. That would probably excuse some of the steps that Castro took over the years. You see him. This is pretty incendiary language. A revolution is not a bed of roses. It's a struggle between the future and the past. Don't expect it to be easy or pleasant. You can condemn me. It does not matter. History will absolve me. And the revolution is a dictatorship. Yes, absolutely. But of the exploited against the exploiters. Now, you could find many people with experience in Cuba that would say, listen, this is a guy that was power hungry. He kept his power. Don't give me, we're doing this for the exploited. But that is a part of the Marxist idea, that if you simply allow the powers that be to own the wealth, to own the media, and then let's say, let's have free elections, my God, the people with all the money and all the influence, they'll get their candidates elected. What we are doing is installing a type of government that will benefit the vast majority of people, and we will have to be pretty fierce against the enemies of this. And you can say what you want to about Cuba. It got, compared to other countries in Latin America, human rights situations not worse than Guatemala in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, not worse than Nicaragua before their revolution, and at least the people had an incredibly high literacy rate. Healthcare was provided, and pretty good quality healthcare, particularly while the Soviet Union was there. Castro, like many other major historical figures, he's complicated. To give you an idea of what the United States was attempting to do, this was formed during the Eisenhower administration, and when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated in 1961, he gave the go-ahead. The U.S. government was training armed Cuban rebels, people that left Cuba that wanted to overthrow Castro. And Kennedy had said, look, once you land, we'll send in Air Force support to bomb back the Cuban army. Kennedy changed his mind on this. Kennedy felt, wait a minute, the Russians could be ready to attack to protect their ally. It doesn't make sense to do it. But the one thing the United States knows, because Castro is horrible and he's a dictator, the moment the Cuban people see these brave counter-revolutionaries show up, they will rally behind them and finish the job. And you know what? They were wrong. The people of Cuba on the island, they attack. They go after these invaders. They support Castro and their government. And again, there are reasons why there was a lot of popular support for Fidel Castro, and still is to this day, although I think some of the rose is certainly off the bloom. Well, the rebellion is destroyed. The United States is publicly humiliated. The United States just raised an army to overthrow another country's government, and they got caught doing it, and they failed. This is where the CIA says, okay, we'll take care of this in a more secretive way. To Fidel Castro's credit, he survived. He died of natural causes 55, 57, 58, whatever it was years later. And there is a grudging respect in some circle for Castro that he was able to do that. Yeah, the Bay of Pigs invasion, these are the Cuban mercenaries that were hired in the United States. That is Che Guevara. That is Fidel riding a tank, by the way, which is kind of cool. You know, all of this, I mean, much like the Japanese, and we know the Japanese turned into a vicious military machine during World War II, but the Japanese were kind of heroes to many part of that third world. Why? They had risen up on their own and challenged the white Western powers, and this is very much the case with Castro as well. That Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution stood up 60 miles from Washington, D.C., against the most powerful military, economic, and political force in the history of the world. And they said no. And they simply kept surviving. They avoided invasions, they avoided assassinations, they survived the economic sanctions, the embargoes, etc. Fidel stood down in 2008, although he lived another 7-8 years, I believe. His brother Raul took power in 2008, and Raul, as I said, just this week, April of 2021, is finally stepping down from power. Castro very much believed, he was an internationalist. He says, look, this is not about Cuba, this is about the oppressed classes of the world, and becomes an exporter of revolution, sends soldiers to Angola, sends to other parts of the world, sends military help, sends technological, medical help, etc. Now, from an American standpoint, do you see what those communists do? They try to spread their ideology. At which point, Castro and the Soviets would say, what is the United States doing with military bases in 100 different countries? That's true today in 2021. What, the United States is not trying to influence governments around the world economically, politically, and militarily? And of course, from the American perspective, well, that's different. We're the United States. We should do... Oh, well, you kind of catch yourself in a certain double standard and hypocrisy there. You know, again, Castro is tricky. I have a friend that I agree with politically very, very much, but her family was exiled from Cuba, and they legitimately suffered some pretty bad treatment while they were there. When Fidel Castro died, all she could think is good, the man is a monster, and, you know, we had some back and forth. It was friendly, but pretty emotional in some ways. I am, by the way, not a Fidel Castro was fantastic. Fidel Castro was a hero. I think it's far more complicated, but you can look at some stuff. He got rid of this corrupt U.S.-dominated dictatorship. In Cuba, an incredibly small part of the population controlled almost all the land and all the wealth. Well, that changed in Cuba. Literacy rates, the highest in Latin America. Absolutely not even close. The healthcare system perhaps didn't have the modern technology of the best in the United States, but Cuban doctors were all over the world working with people. Life expectancy in Cuba higher than any place in Latin America, and that's because of that medical system. And notice what you're seeing happening here is the communists in Cuba are saying, look, we prioritize the right to eat, the right to a home, the right to an education, the right to health care. That's more important to us than completely free speech. That may not be something you agree with, but you can understand why the poor farmer whose children are getting medical care and a chance to learn to read and write are maybe willing to sacrifice the right to protest against the government. I'm not saying that's the right decision, but it's worth thinking about. Speaking of healthcare, when I was in Ethiopia about 12 years ago, I met a woman whose name was Fatima Umer. Her photograph, I believe, is up here in my room right now. I'm looking around for it. Maybe she didn't make it on the wall here. But an older woman in a village, probably in her 50s or so. And, you know, I think I bought a bag of carrots from her or something. And we're kind of communicating through sign language. And she says, you know, Amharic. Do you speak Amharic, which is the language of Ethiopia? No, but no English. No, no. She mentions another East African language. No, no, no. And then she says, Espanol? I said, Sí, yo hablo español. Oh, yo también. Blah, blah, blah. Wait a minute. A small village in eastern Ethiopia with a woman at the market speaking really good Spanish? You know why? Well, she was able to explain to me because she spoke Spanish and I understood Spanish. When the Ethiopians had undergone their own communist revolution, Cuban doctors were sent by the thousands to Ethiopia to help build up the medical care. And this woman, Fatima Umer, had taken a boarder, a Cuban doctor that lived in her home for 3 years and taught her Spanish. How about that? Isn't that something? You can also point out, and this is tied to the corrupt dictatorship, that, look, Cuba had been absolutely dominated by foreign powers for 400 years, and there is something to be said for independence. This is one of the reasons why many Cubans still are very grateful for Fidel Castro for leaving this. You know, also, you can make an argument, I don't think it's the whole answer, but what else was Castro going to do? If the United States, so close with so much power, is bombarding the airwaves and the press and actively sending in armies to overthrow him and attempting to assassinate him, can you really say, well, Castro should have just let people speak openly and trust people? That probably would have been suicide for him. You know what? Let's look at the con side. I think you can make a good argument that for some of the nastiness, and there's some brutality, that Castro really did bring some needed changes to Cuba. But hanging on for 50 years, at some point did he just become yet another corrupt dictator? He meant it at first, and then it became about him. And I think you can make that argument. Look, limited freedoms, yes. Freedom of speech, Free elections, no. And Cuba's economy, for all the progress in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, when the Soviet Union fell apart, things changed. That's around 1990, and suddenly the outside support from the Soviet Union, economic conditions in Cuba, not good today. Worse than Haiti, which has been a pro-U.S. government for the most part? Actually, no, probably not. Worse than Honduras and Guatemala, also client states of the United States? Nah, probably not. But there have been some really bad economic decisions, and things are not easy for Cuban people. Persecution of political opponents, of homosexuals, that was an early issue with Fidel and with Che Guevara, kind of his right-hand man from Argentina. And there's no particularly excusing that. The destabilization of the region, that's one more person exporting weapons, exporting armies, etc. And again, I do know people that would have said up until about the 1990s, Castro did a lot of things wrong. But he probably brought some real overall benefits to the Cuban people. What he should have done, though, is when the economy started to fall apart because Soviet support was gone, at this point he should have recognized clinging to power is not benefiting our people, but he didn't. So again, I'm not necessarily endorsing any of these particular arguments, pro and con necessarily. I'm saying that they are at least legitimate arguments to be made. And as I've said, Taborga's class is easy. 6 plus 6 equals 14. There's no debate about it. But Fidel Castro, hero, villain, dictator, liberation leader, boy, you can make some arguments on any side of it. I assume most of you have seen in particular this picture here on the left. Ernesto Che Guevara, wish we had more time for him. A fascinating character who in some ways is bigger today than he was when he was alive. You've probably seen his name on t-shirts, on taxi cabs, yes, here in Bolivia. He was an Argentinian doctor from an upper middle class family with fairly left-wing politics. And the story is that he went on a motorcycle trip with another doctor friend of his and saw firsthand the brutal, brutal, brutal poverty and exploitation and decided, I can't go back to just being a doctor. I want to change the world. The romantic vision of Che Guevara is a man who put his life on the line for a better world. He was a leader. He risked his life. The guy had chronic asthma, but was living for years on end, crawling through jungles trying to survive. One thing you can say about this revolutionary, he wasn't one of those people that sat at home and said, hey, all the rest of you should go risk your lives. I'm too important for that. Che Guevara put his life on the line on a daily basis and eventually was killed in 1967. There's also the dark side to Che. Became, in effect, sort of a killing machine, a pretty vicious, violent guy in some ways, which he justified as saying, look, I'm sorry, in a world in which children are dying every single minute of starvation, we can't afford to settle for nice, cooperative nonviolence. We've got to destroy this power structure that lets this happen. But a very, very tricky. I've read a couple biographies of him, and I'm still not sure what to say of him. He saw what happened in 1954 in Guatemala, where the United States basically said, this government that you folks have elected, that's doing some pretty good stuff for the poor Guatemalan people, that government doesn't really benefit United States interests. And the United States largely just pushed that government out and led to horrible repercussions for Guatemalans. Well, Che Guevara saw this and decided, I am a revolutionary. He meets Fidel Castro in Mexico. They are part of an invasion of Cuba in 1959 that could never succeed, but it does, becomes kind of Castro's right-hand man, is eventually put in charge of Cuba's national bank, which is a problem because apparently Fidel could not even Che could not balance his own check account. A brilliant guy, not because he was dumb, he just didn't do numbers. And I think a mistake we can say of a lot of these revolutionary movements is the belief that if you're revolutionarily pure, it'll all work itself out. And in fact, it doesn't. You have to understand economics. You have to look at realities. He left Cuba in 1965, fighting in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there was a guerrilla movement there. By the way, I know Sifa Kabila, who knows her father Joseph, who was the president of Congo, who knew his father Laurent, who worked with Che Guevara directly when he was in the Congo. So you are connected by only a few degrees of separation from Che Guevara to Castro, etc., etc. Just FYI. And as you know, he is killed by the Bolivian army with some CIA help in Bolivia in 1967. His goal was to come to Bolivia and turn it into the next Vietnam, where the evil capitalist will be overthrown and the people will rise up in a communist rebellion, etc. It was pretty unrealistic and potentially pretty destructive. I don't have great things to say about the Bolivian governments in the 50s or 60s, but another Vietnam is probably not in most people's interest in Bolivia. You can stop and read these on your own, and you see a compassionate, brave man, and, at some point, kind of a killing machine as well. So he is a difficult character to wrap our heads around historically. This is the big event. This is when the world nearly ended. American planes are flying over Cuba, spy planes, taking photographs, and you know what they discover? The Soviet Union is building nuclear missile launchers on the island of Cuba, 60 miles away from the United States, 500 miles away from Washington, D.C. O.M., possibly F.G. So the spy planes discover this. It's happening. It's so close to the United States. Further intelligence and scanning the seas, the Russians are continuing to build these weapons. There are some choices. People in the U.S. military say, Mr. Kennedy, we need to start bombing. Send the planes in, send in the Air Force, bomb that installation. Do not allow this to happen. Kennedy, quite wisely, I think, recognizes if we begin bombing Soviet installations in Cuba, understand that the Soviet Union and the United States have both got hydrogen bombs and a lot of them. This could be the start of World War III, excuse me, which will be a lot nastier than World War II. The military, some folks in the military are demanding that this happen, and Kennedy says, no, we have time. Our intelligence tells us we have about 2 weeks, 10 days to 2 weeks until the Russians are able to fire missiles from Cuba. So they set up a blockade, and as the Soviet ships start coming toward Cuba, American warships are there, and the world stops and holds its breath. If you talk to virtually anybody alive at this point, they're going to remember this week. I have never talked to anybody born, I'd say before about 1953 that doesn't remember that week. Because, of course, there is television at this point, and this is public, and John F. Kennedy is talking to the people of the United States, and it's going around the planet. Look, Soviet ships are coming to install nuclear missile launchers in Cuba, and the United States will not allow this to happen. End of story. Now, what happens if an American ship fires on a Soviet ship, and a Soviet ship fires back, and American sailors are killed, Soviet sailors are killed? Does somebody bring in the Air Force? You can see where the possibility of this turning into a full-on confrontation and perhaps nuclear. It's a real possibility. Famous photograph of John F. Kennedy in the Oval Office, kind of the weight of the moment captured in that photograph. Kennedy with his younger brother, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General, one of his top advisors. So the Russian ships move toward Cuba. Is it World War III? Well, at the last minute, the phrase was Khrushchev, who is the head of the Soviet Union, of course, the premier of the Soviet Union, blinks. He says, fine, I'm turning around our ships. You know what, though? There was actually a deal that happened. It was not publicly announced, but a deal was made. Robert Kennedy speaks to the Soviet ambassador and says, all right, you know that the United States cannot allow nuclear weapons to be built off the coast of the United States. We're not going to allow it. How do we avoid war? And the Soviets say, we're going to make a deal. If we agree to withdraw these missiles, number one, the United States needs to make an open promise to leave Cuba alone. Number two, the United States has got nuclear missiles in Turkey on the border of the Soviet Union. You need to remove those. The United States, look, we can't be blackmailed. The agreement is both sides will do what they say, but it will not be publicly announced. On the surface, it does look like the Soviet Union backed down, but it was more negotiated than that. This does not play well in the Soviet Union. A couple of years later, Khrushchev is forced out of office, and many believe it was the failure in the Cuban Missile Crisis that led this to happen. You know, I had one more thing, though, about Cuba. I thought I had one more slide. At the time, people understood that we were really close to a possible nuclear confrontation, which could have ended life on the planet in a meaningful way. In the 1990s, after the Soviet Union opened up, some of the archives were relieved, the papers, and we discovered, shockingly, that we were much closer than we thought. First of all, the Soviets were not a couple weeks away from finishing these missiles. They had fully operational missiles that were ready to be fired. The United States didn't know this. Secondly, the commander on the ground in Cuba were given permission, a couple of commanders. If you feel like you need to fire one of these missiles, you make that decision. You don't need to check with Moscow. Hypothetically, if American Air Force had been flying in and attacking these missile sites, is it possible it would have been fired? And there's a good chance of that. There is also, and I don't recall his name, but there was a Soviet nuclear submarine commander who got a message. We understand the United States is attacking. You can go ahead and fire a nuclear missile at the United States. And he stopped. He said, wait a minute, this is too big a step. It was apparently, as we now understand, in that one individual's hand to fire a nuclear missile. And once a nuclear missile is fired at the United States, guys, we know what's going to happen. It'll be an all-out missiles raining down on both sides. Hopping back a little bit in Guatemala. You see Guatemala here in green, a little bit south of Mexico. By the way, it is the Bolivia of Central America because it has a huge indigenous population. They're very, very similar in many ways. I've spent some time there. 1952, remember, the United States believes in free, open elections, right? That's what democracy is. Well, the Guatemalan people elect a man named Jacobo Arbenz. And Arbenz says, you know what? We got to make some changes. We have a desperately poor population. We have a relatively few people, especially the American-owned company of United Fruit. They own all of the land. That's not right. We're going to start taking land from wealthier people and distributing to peasants. And this included some of his family's land, by the way. It also included land owned by the United Fruits Company. Now, the United Fruit Company is from the United States. They were reimbursed for it, but there was a little game of accounting going on. Now, United Fruit paid the Guatemalan government for paid taxes, right? They paid taxes on the land they own. And every year, United Fruit said, well, all the land we own is worth $1 million, so here's our $20,000 in taxes. When Arbenz announces that the land is going to be appropriated, he says, don't worry, we're going to pay you back the $1 million for the land that we confiscated. And United Fruit says, but it's worth $50 million. Well, your own records say it was worth $1 million. Well, we just did that to avoid paying tax. Ooh. The bottom line is here you have a government that is acting against a U.S. corporation. Arbenz, by the way, is not a communist. He simply is not. You know what? He's a Franklin Roosevelt, New Deal, left of center. There is a total of one communist in his 20-person cabinet. He's not a communist. But to the United States, in the midst of the Cold War, anybody who's not reliably anti-communist is a communist. And by the way, from the Soviet Union's perspective, just reverse that 180 degrees. Yeah, I guess 4 of the 51 seats in his parliamentary coalition were communist. That's not a communist. Well, the United States decides we can't live with this. We cannot live with anybody who will even listen to left-wing ideas. And the United States, through the CIA, starts funding the military, helps support a coup d'etat that overthrows the Arbenz government. And from this point, we have a civil war that lasts 35 years that kills probably a couple 100,000 Guatemalans. It's a country population not much different than Bolivia. So this is a huge number of people. In some cases, we are talking an almost genocide of the Mayan Indian population. Truth reports afterwards are looking at this, and look, there were deaths and violent behavior on all sides, but 90+% are attributed to the military, including flat massacres. I was in a town called Todos Santos, Cuchumatan. I attended some language schools there, and this is a place where the military came in the early 1980s, simply said, we want all men 12 years or older, we want you in the church right now. The church was set on fire, and virtually every man was massacred. My teacher, a man named Margarito Calvo Cruz, he was actually in a neighboring city that weekend. He and his older brother survived. But this is the type thing happened, and it's not only the United States that set up this government. The soldiers are trained there. A place called the School of the Americas specifically trained soldiers from Latin America and around the world and leaders in anti-communist tactics. And this included kidnappings, murders, assassinations, by any means necessary. The United States did apologize formally for a role that it played in this. This was not, but again, I guess that's a start, maybe to some degree of healing. But the United States was not a good actor. Brazil, relatively less about, but of course it is the big economic and population power. I think, yeah, fifth largest population in the world, geographically, but also the fifth biggest population, one of the biggest economies in the world, but with desperate poverty. Friends I know from Brazil say, wow, the really, really poor parts of Brazil, they're pretty dangerous. And here you see basically squatters communities where people built their own shacks in the midst of all of this wealth. Yes, once again, the United States was directly involved in the overthrow of a democratically elected government. You're gonna see there's a pattern here for sure. There is a military dictatorship that rules until 1985. When I published, I said 30 years of fairly stable democracy. Things have been a little bit tense the last couple of years with Jair Bolsonaro taking over, a very, very much right-wing force. Brazil, as you know, as I'm speaking in 2021, probably has the worst COVID impact in the entire world. I think it's the second highest death total in the world, and it's absolutely out of control. And it's partly because they have a government led by President Bolsonaro who simply refuses to act on these things. Another thing to mention about Brazil, the biggest existing rainforest in the world in the Amazon is there. It's being destroyed pretty rapidly, and that's something that, of course, could have repercussions around the planet, not just for Brazilians. Argentina, our neighbor largely to the south, boy, it couldn't be more different than Bolivia. Bolivia's population is about half indigenous, give or take. Some estimates say 60%, some say 40%, but a lot of people who identify as indigenous. Argentina is largely a European country. It's German, it's Spanish, etc. Has generally been a fairly wealthy country. The G20 is the collection of the 20 most dominant economies in the world that meet. They're part of this. Pretty high literacy rate, problem with poverty to be sure, but it comes close to being a first world country. We don't have a lot of time to talk about Juan Peronism, we just don't have the time for it. But the key event in Argentina's history is a military coup in 1976. And it's called Operation Condor. Operation Condor is organized by, yes, the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States that is attempting to attack leftist guerrilla movements or leftist political movements in all of these countries, you'll notice, including Bolivia. It's called the Cone of South America. Leads to what is known in Argentina as the Dirty War. Some 30,000 opponents of the military or alleged opponents or, anybody who wasn't willing to sort of salute and say, yes, sir, no, sir, were victims of violence, of repression, and in 30,000 cases, the estimate's just simply assassinated by the military and by paramilitaries. These are informal groups that work in the cities with the approval of the military-run government, but not strictly wearing uniforms. So on assassinations, bombings, death squads, they are known as. We had them here in Bolivia as well. Return to democracy in 1983. Argentina went through a massive economic collapse in the early 90s. We know they've been having fairly serious problems with inflation today as well. So Argentina is still a power, but it's been kind of a shaky power in recent years. Yeah, Juan Perón, I'm going to skip through him here in the interest of time. But another, this is in some ways, whether from the left or from the right, South America has this history of caudillismo. In other words, the military strongman who makes the society run. And there are different relationships to these guys. In some cases, they're flat out brutal dictators, they're thugs, they're mass murderers, that's all you can say. In other cases, they are people that really did bring some legitimate change to the society that sometimes benefit a lot of people. Now, are you willing to give up your freedom to oppose, to speak out, to have your voice heard if there's more order, better food in the society? That's a tough thing to try to work. Again, the popular poorer classes loved the guy. Argentina did not, under Perón, become, look, are you with the United States, the Soviet Union? Had kind of a middle course, and definitely some of the Perón changes do bring fight against poverty. That is true. On the other hand, he is a dictator. Of course he's a dictator. Problems with corruption, absolutely. You know what? Dictatorships tend to lead to corruption at some point. And here's the tricky one for a lot of people. A book called The Trial of Henry Kissinger, a no longer alive British author, wrote a book arguing that Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State under Richard Nixon, was a Nobel Peace Prize winner, which was kind of a joke to me, but should have been put on trial for war crimes. In 1971, the Chilean people held an open, free election. Again, this is something the United States like. They elected a man named Salvador Allende. Salvador Allende was, I would probably call him on the socialist left. He is absolutely not a communist. He is absolutely not a destroy all private property, but he believes in a strong government that actively works with the economy, tries to redistribute wealth. Absolutely. He is not particularly friendly with U.S. corporate powers like AT&T Communications. He expects them, in some cases, to give up the property they own, be lightly reimbursed, and turn it over to the state. You saw that Richard Nixon, who had said earlier, his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said, "I see no reason why we should allow a country to fall into the hands of communists just because their people are ignorant." Again, Allende was not a communist. Richard Nixon said, you know what we need to do? We need to make Chile's economy scream. In other words, we will use our economic power, like we've been trying to do in Cuba, to destroy this government and the support behind him. There is a coup with the CIA, once again, is deeply, directly involved in. I think it's misleading to say the United States government overthrew Salvador Allende and caused him to commit suicide in the Royal Palace. No, that is not what happened. The United States was working with opponents to Salvador Allende, including military people and other people that opposed him, sending money, organizing, sending weapons, was an active part of this military coup. But it's not simply the United States did it by itself. Augusto Pinochet is installed as the military leader of Chile, and for the next 20 years runs, I don't know what to call it, except a vicious, human rights denying military dictatorship. The United States is okay with this because, after all, he's not a communist. I will point out, and we'll look at this when we look at Eastern Europe later, the Soviet Union was not okay with non-communist states, and they were fine with really vicious communist dictatorships because they were on their side. So it doesn't simply go that the United States was the bad guy in this. Victor Jara was a well-known folk singer at the point, not only executed by the Pinochet regime. When he's being tortured in prison, they cut off his hands, threw his guitar at his feet, and said, "Play your songs now." I mean, this is pretty nasty stuff. By the way, the term disappeared. You've seen this in a couple places. What we're getting at here is, we know what an assassination is, what an execution is. But what about the guy, the political activist, who drove from his home and was never seen again? It's understood. One of the paramilitary squads intercepted him, executed him, buried the body. But there are, in both Argentina and in Chile, and by the way also in Bolivia as well, a lot of people who weren't formally executed, they were disappeared. They did not live, they did not survive, but the body was never found. This is part of the terror, of course, to keep people in line. And then Nicaragua is such an interesting case. You have a family, you know what? It is the Caudillos, right? It is the corrupt military family that just ruled Nicaragua. And you know what? The Nicaraguans and his royal and their families, the Somozas and their family, and the business folks and the church hierarchy and the U.S. businesses, they do just great. Franklin Roosevelt, this is actually something that he said about the Somoza family, about the dictator Anastasio Somoza Sr. It's like, well, Mr. Roosevelt, this man is a horrifying human rights violator. He's corrupt. And Roosevelt said, you know what? He's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. We got to be willing to deal with him because he works well for the United States. In 1979, there is a revolution. This guerrilla movement had been going on for decades, all the way back to the 1930s. The Sandinistas, they're called, named after Augusto Sandino, who was executed by the Somoza regime in the 1930s. They are leftist guerrillas. They believe in a Marxist-Leninist state. They want to overthrow the government, and they become successful. There is a massive earthquake, I believe in 1973, that just destroys Managua, and there are millions and tens of millions of dollars coming from around the world to help rebuild, and you know what? Nothing gets rebuilt. The money goes into the hands of the Somoza family, and they just let people suffer. So he's deeply unpopular. The Sandinistas eventually, using Cuban support, Russian support, no question about it, they overthrow the Somoza family. This is the son of Somoza Jr., who is overthrown and take control. Now, who are these people? Are they communists? Are they just nationalists? Are they to the left of center but willing to work with the United States? And almost immediately, the United States, this is the Cold War. I'm sorry. We are seeing possibilities that you are diehard communists. You're working with the Cubans. You are the enemy. And the United States cuts off pretty much all supplies to the impoverished country of Nicaragua. Starting in 1981, the United States, the CIA again, starts organizing what is known as the Contras. These are anti-Sandinista militias who are fighting in the countryside to try to overthrow this. Some of this are people that I used to be a Sandinista, but I don't like what this new government is doing. In more cases, these are the old military National Guard people. The United States sends huge amounts of money. Something like 80% of their budget comes from the United States to wage a civil war in Nicaragua to get rid of what is seemingly a popular government. Civil war goes on through the 1980s, probably kills about 70,000 people in what's already a very poor country. In 1985, Congress, and I was part of a protest to demand that Congress cut off money to the Contras. This is Nicaragua's business, not the U.S. government's business. Congress cuts off all aid to the Contras. We're going to come back to that. Some images here from the Sandinistas. Iran? This doesn't belong here. What a terrible mistake. Iran, of course, is an oil-rich country in the Middle East. Something that you don't necessarily know right now because we haven't covered this area. There was a pro-U.S. government in charge in Iran until 1977, I believe it was. It's overthrown by an Islamist fundamentalist Islamist group. It becomes the Iranian Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Iran becomes an avowed enemy of the United States. There is at one point, we'll cover this later, like I said, take over the U.S. Embassy, hold 50 Americans hostage for a year. The United States, it cuts off all dealings with Iran. It's illegal to trade with Iran, and certainly you would not send weapons to Iran. Now, what does this have to do with Nicaragua? Well, in 1986, this is Ronald Reagan's period in the United States, a report breaks out. The Reagan administration had been secretly selling weapons to Iran, the United States' enemy. Wait a minute. What's going on? That's illegal. Why are they doing it? Well, they deny it. This is not happening. This is not happening. Eventually, so much evidence came out. Yeah, we kind of sold weapons to Iran. It helped us get rid of some hostages that have been held. But then a further question comes. Okay, if the United States has been selling tens of millions of dollars of weapons to its enemy in Iran, where is that money going to? Notice, this is 1986. In 1985, what did the United States Congress stop the United States from doing? Sending aid to the anti-Sandinista Contra army. That was illegal to do. But now, the Reagan administration has all this money from the arms sales, and yes, they secretly and illegally send the money to the Contras in Nicaragua, despite the fact that this was flat out illegal. Suffice to say that there was never a reckoning for this. Ronald Reagan, the president, he knew what was going on. George H.W. Bush, the vice president, he knew what was going on. Many people in the administration knew this. I believe one guy went to prison for a couple of months. End of story. Incidentally, one of the things that was happening, the CIA during this period of the Contras was mining the harbors of Managua, meaning if you try to bring your ships in, there are explosives underwater. I want you to stop for a second. What would the United States do if Bolivia was found to have planted mines in New York Harbor? The United States would never stop attacking Bolivia. We would reduce this country to a bunch of rubble. Why is it okay for the United States to plant mines in another country that is not at war with? By the way, none of this is complete. The Sandinistas were uniquely the good guys. Daniel Ortega, the lead Sandinista, has come back into power, and he's proven himself to be a pretty vicious, thuggish guy who is destroying... He's done some awful things in Nicaragua. This is not a pro-Sandinista lecture by any means. But again, is it the United States' rights, because they don't like the government of another country, to fund a civil war and mine the harbors? I think there are some pretty legitimate questions. Finally, and I made this slide about 10 years ago, so I'll keep this there. There was a sense with the Sandinistas being defeated in an election, and by the way, much to their credit, this is about 1992, the Sandinistas said, you know what? We lost. We're stepping down. It was thought at this point, there were books being written about the death of the Latin American left, and then, wouldn't you know it, history works in cycles. Hugo Chavez in Venezuela led a leftist revolt in Venezuela. Evo Morales, I think you know quite well, again, running in the movement towards socialism. Michelle Bachelet in Chile. Lula da Silva in Brazil, who was imprisoned on corruption charges 4 or 5 years ago that almost certainly were manufactured. I mean, as more and more comes out, he was likely going to be re-elected in Brazil 3 years ago, but because he was imprisoned, he was not able to run, and Brazilian people turned to the far-right candidate, Jair Bolsonaro. Lula is talking about running again in next year's election. He's 77, 78, but still very popular in that country. So we're not sure exactly where we are right now. Morales is gone. He did try to stay in power too long. I understand, on the other hand, his party won the presidency. On the other hand, his party also lost a number of governorships. Venezuela still has it's falling apart entirely. Some say Chavez was an effective leader and the guy who took over, Maduro, was completely off his base. Some point fingers legitimately at Chavez and some mistakes that he had made. There is a more right-wing government today in Chile, but a lot of protest in recent years, in the last year or so. You know this. Chileans are going to vote on a new constitution later this year that might bring some changes. What does the future hold? We don't know. Let me leave with this. If you're interested in doing some reading about Bolivia in your lifetime, and yes, I do have e-copies of all of these. The most recent, Will Grant's Populista, which looks at the major, mass popular candidates, generally of the left in this area. He looks, for example, has a very effective chapter on Evo Morales, which I think is worth reading, on Chavez in Venezuela, etc. Seems to me that he does a very good job of having balance. He is, sure, he has his own politics, but he is very critical of some of these leaders, while at the same time trying to explain the reason for their appeal. So I'd recommend that. More of a travel log, Kim Macquarie, very good writer, writes about traveling in various parts of the Andes. Oliver Balch, also kind of a travel log, Via South America. Those two are both about 10 years old or so. And Andres Aguirre's Potosi, about the mining community and history. Many of you might have seen him as a guest speaker. So if you're interested in 3 of the books, the Potosi book, he's somebody that I know. I don't feel like giving away his book, but you can get a copy in Spanish here in Bolivia. The others, let me know if you're interested in reading any of these, because I think you would learn a lot about the country. Right, that is it. See you next time.